इंडिया न्यूज लड़ेगा जनता का मुकदमा।
नमस्कार दोस्तों, मेरे साथ आज की शाम इस एक्सक्लूसिव इंटरव्यू में एक काफ़ी इम्पोर्टेंट शख्स जुड़ रहे हैं, क्योंकि ये जो शख्स है वो अपने तमाम कामों से हमेशा से कंट्री के हित को सबसे सर्वोपरि रखते हैं। और आपके शो का मकसद यही है कि उन सब शख्स को आपके सामने लेके आया जाए जो हमेशा देश हित की बात करते हैं और इंडिया फर्स्ट की बात करते हैं। आई एम एक्सट्रीमली डिलाइटेड that in this exclusive interview, I have with me very famous historian and a very popular economist and somebody who has shaped the Indian discourse in the last few years through his books and also through his public policy making. But today he's in the capacity of an author because he spent this extreme, I would say, a book which will be a big disruption in the course of how you look at the Indian history. And the book is Revolutionaries, the other side of how India won its freedom. I'm extremely delighted to have Sanjeev Sanyal ji with me. Sanjeev Sanyal ji मेरे साथ ITV Network, NewsX, India News पे जुड़ने के लिए बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
नमस्कार।
Sanjeev ji, first of all, congratulations for this book. Now the title of the book says that Revolutionaries, the other story of how India won its freedom. So my first question, and a very basic question, is ki, what prompted you to write this narrative? Do you believe that in the past 7 decades of independence, this narrative was not told in the textbooks and generally in the writings which are there in the public domain?
Absolutely. So you get the impression that India's freedom struggle is somehow that we politely asked the British to leave and they left. That is not at all the case. India's freedom struggle is an extremely bloody one going back to the 18th century. Almost all of it, by the way, is about armed resistance. And even in the early 20th century, when there was a freedom movement that was from the non-violent side, the Gandhian stream, and I'm not saying that that didn't have a role, it did have a role, but there was also another story with that of armed resistance to British occupation. And that story is simply left out. आपको लगेगा कि ये एक दो क्रांतिकारी इधर उधर थे, किसी ने किसी को बम कहीं भगत सिंह ने कहीं बम फेंक दिया ऐसे ही सुबह उठ के, और कहानी यहीं तक ख़त्म है। असलियत ये है कि ये 5 दशकों तक इन लोगों ने सशस्त्र जो लड़ाई लड़ी अंग्रेज़ों के खिलाफ, उसकी जो कहानी है उसको तो आप टेक्स्ट बुक में पढ़िए या ऑफिशियल डॉक्यूमेंट्री में पढ़िए या कहीं भी, आपको लगेगा कि ये कहानी है ही नहीं। मतलब एक दो इधर उधर, अब ये बहुत प्राचीन काल की कहानी नहीं है, ये तो अभी की कहानी है। अभी भी लोग जीवित हैं जिनको ये लोग पहचानते थे, तो इनके नाम मिटाए नहीं गए हैं। लेकिन आपको ऐसा लगेगा कि ये जो एक दो नाम हैं, भगत सिंह, पहले तो बहुत सारे नाम मिटा दिए गए हैं, लेकिन जो भी नाम रह गए हैं कि ये कुछ इधर उधर उन लोगों ने छोटे मोटे कुछ मतलब काम किए होंगे, लेकिन उसमें इतिहास की धारा में कोई फ़र्क नहीं पड़ा।
हाँ संजीव जी, आई रिमेम्बर जब हम लोग बड़े हो रहे थे और जब हम लोग टेक्स्ट बुक्स में पढ़ते थे, तो हमें जो इंडियन फ्रीडम मूवमेंट की हिस्ट्री पढ़ाई जाती थी वो सिर्फ और सिर्फ गांधीयन पर्सपेक्टिव से पढ़ाई जाती थी। एंड आई वुड से आई एम वेरी सैड कि जब हम लोग बड़े हो रहे थे, हमारे पास आप जिस तरीके से आपने ये बुक लिखी है, ये नैरेटिव नहीं था। अब एक लार्जर डिस्कोर्स है कि वी रियली नीड टू टेल अ न्यू जनरेशन, न्यू इंडिया के अंदर, अमृतकाल के अंदर, कि सच्ची हिस्ट्री क्या थी। सच्ची हिस्ट्री सिर्फ वो नहीं थी जो सिर्फ नॉन वायलेंट थी। अब अगर मैं आपकी किताब को मैंने काफ़ी गंभीरता से पढ़ा है और मैं पूरी नहीं पढ़ पाया हूँ, बट आई हैव गॉन थ्रू 70% ऑफ द बुक एंड आई वांट टू गो टू पेज 4 ऑफ द बुक वेयर यू टाइटल दैट करेक्टिंग द नैरेटिव एंड यू से that the Indian freedom movement, the narrative is not just taught in school textbooks and repeatedly in official documentaries, but also taken for granted by the rest of the world. However, India's freedom for independence was a much more complicated process which included generations of sustained armed resistance. Now you use this word called as armed resistance. और जब हम बड़े हो रहे थे, हमको कहा गया था कि ये जो सब थे ये एक्सट्रीमिस्ट थे, ये जो थे ये फ्रीडम मूवमेंट में एरेंट्स थे. So how do you look at when you talk about correcting the narrative in this context?
So what happened is that unfortunately most of the major leaders of the revolutionary movement were killed by the British, or they went missing, as in the case of Netaji, killed or missing, whatever you may want to say. But basically at the time of independence, Sachindranath Sanyal, Raj Bihari Bose, these kinds of leaders, Bismil, Bhagat Singh, Thapar, Rajguru, none of them were alive. So what happened is that all these people sacrificed their life for independence, but they weren't there to see independence. And so one branch of the Congress, not even the entire branch, because one branch of the Congress essentially captured power, the Nehruvian branch. And they, perhaps it's a human behavior, they suggested that, sort of exaggerated their own role in this freedom. But up to that point, I suppose it's forgivable. What is not forgivable is that then they deliberately went out and edited out the stories of the others. And this was not just by chance. It happened systematically. You have historian R.C. Mazumdar, for example, who was given the job, who was by some margin the most preeminent historian in the of the first half of the 20th century. He was given the job of writing the official history of the freedom struggle. Now, when he began to give space to the wider struggle, he was actually removed from the story. Similarly, all the sites related to the revolutionary movement were either ignored or in some case they were even being deliberately pulled down. For example, people don't realize that the cellular jail survived only by chance. It was almost pulled down. In Maulana Azad Medical College was originally, that site had a jail where many revolutionaries were hanged. But you see, that place where the hanging was happened, the revolutionaries asked that to be turned into a national memorial. But, and by the way, it was agreed to by Nehru. But then what happened is that they simply pulled it down and there is no memorial there. And so on and so forth. So similarly, the soldiers of the INA, the sailors of the Royal Indian Navy who had revolted against British rule, they were actually never, not only were they not taken back into the army and navy and so on, they were not even recognized as freedom fighters for decades. It's only just 2 years ago that the INA soldiers, the last remaining few, were taken down Rajpath on Republic Day. So the point I'm making to you is that this other narrative was not merely ignored, it was erased.
Mr. Sanyal, as a youngster who's grown up in the 2000s, I really feel cheated, and I say that and I say it as bluntly as possible, because if in my school textbooks, when I'm growing up, if I'm not taught the right history, it will definitely shape my discourse as I go forward. And I want to point to different aspects of it. Now, you spoke about the Congress. Now, जो हमको ये पढ़ाया जाता है कि कांग्रेस जब बनी थी इसलिए बनी थी कि देश को आज़ादी दिलानी है. बट जब मैं राइटिंग्स पढ़ता हूँ आपकी किताब के अंदर भी, मैं पढ़ता हूं कि एक ब्रिटिशर ने कांग्रेस को स्थापित किया था, A.O. ह्यूम ने स्थापित किया था, और उसको एक सेफ्टी वॉल्व के तरीके से इस्तेमाल करने की बात की गई थी. यू गो बैक एंड से दैट बिकॉज द रिवोल्ट ऑफ 1857 had really created a sense of urgency in the British कि कोई भी अगर violence ना हो जाए, कोई armed struggle आगे ना हो जाए, तो एक safety wall create करने की जरूरत है. In fact, when I read what Dadabhai Naroji had said, and this is what you quote in page number 20 of your book, I have never faltered in my faith in the British character, and have always believed that the time will come when the sentiments of the British nation and our gracious sovereign proclaimed to us in the great charter of the proclamation of 1858 will be realized. Now, how can these people be nationalists? कि अगर एक व्यक्ति जब कोई ऑर्गेनाइजेशन बन रही है उसमें वो सर्विलिटी ब्रिटिश एम्पायर की तरफ दिखा रहा है, तब तो सवाल यही उठेंगे कि ये एक्चुअली मॉडरेट्स थे या ब्रिटिश लॉयलिस्ट थे.
देखिए, सीधी बात है, मैंने ये सब जो शब्द आपने कोट किए हैं मैंने तो नहीं लिखे. तो ऐतिहासिक ये सच है कि जो इंडियन नेशनल कांग्रेस के जो स्थापक थे वो अंग्रेज़ थे. उन्होंने ये इसकी स्थापना क्यों की, वो भी उन्होंने लॉर्ड डफरिन के साथ जो उनका कॉरेस्पॉन्डेंस है उसमें चिट्ठियों में लिखा है क्यों कर रहे हैं सेफ्टी वाल्व. तो ये जो आइडिया है ये मुझसे नहीं निकला है, ये तो उन्होंने अपने हाथों से लिखा हुआ है. तो इसको अचानक से कोई मैंने सामने नहीं रखा है. बहुत पहले भी दूसरे
नहीं, पर 70 साल से कहीं था ही नहीं ना। इतने हिस्टोरियंस मैंने पढ़ा है, हम लोग को पढ़ाया जाता है, यूपीएससी सिविल सर्विसेज के एस्पिरेंट्स पढ़ते थे, उनको कहते थे आप बिपिन चंद्रा पढ़ो, आप रोमिला थापर पढ़ो, और इससे आप हिस्ट्री के जो ऑप्शनल्स देते थे, इन सब के अंदर तो ये चीजें सच्चाई में दिखाई नहीं जाती थी। इनफैक्ट एओ ह्यूम के ऊपर सिर्फ 3 स्क्वीमिश रूप से पैराग्राफ्स हुआ करते थे टेक्स्ट बुक में। तो मेरा सवाल, तो क्यों इनने 70 साल, व्हाई डू यू थिंक दैट दोज हु कॉल देमसेल्फ एज द bastions of carrying the Indian history forward, why didn't they at least tell the truth? I'm not.
Well, there are two parts to it. One of them is the way the history itself was told was after independence. Much of the intellectuals of modern India were not those who fought for independence, but most of them were actually collaborators. It's astonishing how many collaborators ended up becoming our intellectual class, whether they were from the civil service or they were other forms of collaboration in the intellectual class in various ways. So the historians, writers, civil servants of the first maybe 2 generations after independence were not themselves fought for independence or descendants of those. So naturally, they wanted to project a very different story and they wanted to cover up the tracks in a sense. And that's what they did. And so that shows through in the language they use. So for example, the English, so in Hindi you use naram dal, garam dal, maybe that you can get away with. But in the English narrative, you use the word that the schism inside the Congress in the first decade of the 20th century was between the nationalists, the extremists and the moderates. Now, who were the extremists and who were the moderates? So the extremists were Lal Bal Pal. What were they asking for? They were asking for freedom. Now, how is that an extreme demand? Whereas the moderates were basically writing these petitions saying that, oh, please give us these small concessions. Now, they were considered to be the reasonable people. Now, if you take the revolutionaries' language on this, what I have, since this book is about history from a revolutionary perspective, I've used it, called one of them the nationalists and called the other the loyalists, which I think is the much better way of expressing this. So once you begin to see it in this light, a very different history emerges out of the documents that are still available.
No, I think it's the true history, Mr. Sanyal, and you've done great amount of national service. But you know what worries me is that, before delving further on this aspect, is when I was coming for this interview, I went on Google and really typed on the how is Congress formed. And when I was going to the top links on Google, I found that the theory of safety valve was not present. The still extremist and moderates in 1905 is present. And this is just not one document. Even the coaching institutes which make individuals ready for the civil services examinations, most of them, the documents which are taught are the same. So in an era where we are talking about Amrit Kal, when we are talking about really telling our generation the real history of India, do you believe that this is definitely an inflection point? Your book, I believe, is an inflection point. But this is a start, I would say. There is more which needs to be done.
Absolutely. It is important to tell the story not because of understanding what happened, but this has genuine impact on what happened later. So one of the things is not only were the revolutionaries kept out of government and kept out of power. I mean, there were some exceptions, like in Manipur, the revolutionaries did in fact form the government later. But in most places, what happened is that they were slowly evicted to the edges of the system. A few were incorporated in, but by and large, the revolutionaries were not really allowed to get involved in the independent India. But it gets much worse than that. Think of the areas where the revolutionaries were most powerful. Bengal, Punjab and Maharashtra. Bengal and Punjab were partitioned. Many of those who had fought for Indian independence at the point of independence, they actually lost their homes and they became refugees. In the case of the Maharashtra, particularly Maharashtrian Brahmin community was at the forefront of pushing back against the British. And there were riots in 1948. Hundreds of them were killed. Thousands were thrown out of their homes and their homes were burnt. You have Savarkar's brother, who was stoned to death. A lot is made about, we know Mahatma Gandhi was killed by Godse. Wrong thing. But Godse was hanged. There was no investigation into who actually beat Narayan Savarkar to death. In fact, people don't even know anything about this. And by the way, this same narrative happened to these other two communities as well. Take, for example, the Hindu refugees who came into India in the 1970s during the genocide in East Pakistan. They faced, far from being rehabilitated, they faced the Morij Jhapi massacre in 1979. The Sikhs faced, the 1984 riots. So what I'm trying to tell you is that those who fought for Indian independence from the revolutionary side were not merely ignored and erased, they were actively persecuted in independent India.
I also feel, Mr. Sanyal, that many of them were villainized consciously by the intellectual class, and I'll point towards another aspect of it. You spoke about Lal Bal Path. अब जब हम लोग बड़े होते थे हमें कहा जाता था कि ये एक्सट्रीमिस्ट हैं और इनने कांग्रेस जिस रास्ते में फ्रीडम देश को दिलाने की कोशिश कर रही थी, इनने ऐसी डिमांड्स रखी कि उस वक्त इंडिपेंडेंस नहीं मिलती थी, ये हमको पढ़ाया जाता था हमारे टीचर्स द्वारा. अब जब सच्चाई पढ़ी जाती, जो आपकी टेक्स्ट बुक, आपकी जो किताब भी जिसके बारे में वर्णन करती है, particularly how Bal Gangadhar Tilak used Ganpati festival in Maharashtra to mobilize people. Now the point is, Mr. Sanyal, that all the historians who had spoken about this either spoke about this in very few words or said that he was trying to get religion in national movement. Now my question is that you are speaking also about Hindu revivalism being a very important pillar in India's road to freedom. Absolutely. But this was not spoken about. Can you enlighten how Hindu revivalism was an extremely important pillar? Because most of the historians have spoken about Lal Bal Pal, particularly Bal Gangadhar Tilak, getting religion in national movement from a very negative point of view.
I don't know why we have to be apologetic about the fact that Hindu revivalism was a very important aspect of our national struggle. You see that in, for example, the song Vande Mataram, and we have got the first two paragraphs as our national song. Read the rest of it. I mean, it's clearly Shakta Hindu imagery. These revolutionaries, their initiation rites, for example, are full of Hindu imagery, specifically Shakti worship as imagery. And this happens repeatedly throughout. And by the way, the Sikhs also were very much driven by this, by various reform movements. The Gadarite movement, for example, spread through the Gurudwaras. So I don't think we should be apologetic about it. Almost all of them took, for example, Swami Vivekananda as one of their inspirations. This goes all the way through not just the early revolutionaries, but all the way through to Netaji himself. But incidentally, Netaji was a very big disciple of both Sri Aurobindo and of Vivekananda. In his personal life, he was a very true Shakta and a very religious man, even though he may not have put that into his public life. And you read, whether you read Uttarpada speech of Sri Aurobindo, or you read the writings of Bismil and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that they were bigots. They were inspired by Hinduism. They were certainly Hindu revivalists, but at the same time, they welcomed non-Hindus into the revolutionary movement. So you do have Bismil, who, by the way, was very much into the Shuddhi movement and an Arya Samaji and so on. But his right-hand man is Ashfaqullah Khan. Savarkar, now much vilified as, oh my God, Hindutva, villain and so on. You've got to be kidding me. His right-hand woman was Madam Bhikaji Kama. And so the way people are portraying some of these people, particularly given the context of today's politics, is utterly wrong.
Mr. Sanyal, it is utterly wrong for sure, but I also feel that there is a larger conspiracy through which it has happened, and it is happening at a larger level, and it is happening very consciously. Now, another part which I also observe is that, say for example, our freedom icons, like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, was always looked as a leader who had a lot of presence in Maharashtra. But when I read your book, I'm astonished to know that even Rabindranath Tagore has spoken about Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's greatness, which means, and if I go to your book, and it talks about that in extensive detail. So my question is that these are revolutionaries. Did they get inspiration from, say, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, and or was it something which happened by chance, or was it something where the inspiration had come from our freedom, from our icons of the past, say Shivaji Maharaj, Vivekanand, or Aurobindo?
The freedom fighters were very much inspired by hundreds of years, if not thousands of years of resistance to foreign occupation. While the British were the current group that they were opposing, they had, of course, clear inspiration from those who had opposed Mughal or Turkic invasions of the past. So Shivaji was a particularly popular icon, but you also have many others. For example, Rana Pratap is a major icon. You have the rebel leaders of the 1857-58 revolt, and so on and so forth. So there is a huge amount of respect that these freedom fighters had for these, historical characters. They drew inspiration from them. Of course, they also drew inspiration from what was happening in the rest of the world. So they were inspired by Mazzini. They were inspired by Pan-Asianism of the Japanese, Irish republicanism, and so on and so forth.
Mr. Sanyal, another point is because, when you talk about this, you say, you write in your book, and I quote, that when Sri Aurobindo was writing about it, he also had used very powerful lines from Shivaji, where I undermined an empire and it has not been rebuilt. I created a nation and it has not yet perished. It would have been clear to all the readers that the empire to be undermined was no longer Mughal, but British. So this was, these revolutionaries, when they were working, there was a thought to it, there was a method to it. It was not कि एकदम से सब isolated तरीके से freedom लाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं.
आप सही कह रहे हैं. पहली बात यह है कि उनके बहुत सारे उनके जो पुस्तक हैं, उनके जो आर्टिकल्स लिखे हुए हैं, उनको आप पढ़ेंगे तो आपको समझ में आएगा कि उनकी एक बहुत साफ आइडियोलॉजी थी, उनकी एक स्ट्रेटजी थी, और ये सिर्फ भारत के अंदर उनका नेटवर्क नहीं था. उनके भारत के अंदर एक अखाड़ों का नेटवर्क था जिसका नाम अनुशीलन समिति है, लेकिन भारत के बाहर भी उनके एम्बसीज थे. जर्मनी में, टोक्यो में उनके नेटवर्क अभी कनाडा और अमेरिका में भी थे. और अगर देखेंगे तो फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर में उनके जो एजेंट्स थे वो जर्मनी के सपोर्ट के आधार पे पर्शिया में, जैसे पांडुरंग खानकोजी हैं. पांडुरंग खानकोजी आज जहाँ ईरान कहते हैं, उस समय पर्शिया कहा जाता था, वहाँ वो अंग्रेज़ों के खिलाफ युद्ध कर रहे थे. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि सिर्फ भारत के अंदर ही इनका नेटवर्क रहा था, पूरे दुनिया में था. और ये स्टूडेंट नेटवर्क्स थे, गुरुद्वारों का नेटवर्क था, और अंग्रेज़ इन नेटवर्कों को तोड़ने में लगी हुई थी. अंग्रेज़ के जो स्पाई नेटवर्क्स थे, वो इन गुरुद्वारों के जो नेटवर्क हैं उनको ये लोग इन्फिल्ट्रेट कर रहे थे. तो आज you may think, why is it that Khalistani movement is in Canada? Yeah. The reason the Khalistani movement is in Canada is very simple. In the First World War, the Gadarite nationalists were using the network of these gurudwaras across the world, but particularly in North America, to create a revolutionary group that was going to fight against the British. So the British then infiltrated these gurudwaras. They paid off collaborationist groups, deliberately divided the Hindus and the Sikhs by pumping in huge amounts of money. We even know the name of the agent. His name was Hopkinson. Ultimately, a Gadarite Sikh called Meva Singh shot him dead in a court in Canada because of what he was doing. So, unfortunately, nobody in India knows Meva Singh.
Mr. Sanyal, so you are, if I get it correctly, you are saying that ब्रिटिशर्स, जब भी ब्रिटिशर्स को लगता था कि कोई भी रेवोल्यूशनरी या कोई भी रेवोल्यूशनरी मूवमेंट बहुत बड़ा हो रहा है, तो उसके अंदर वो या तो अपने स्पाइस बेचते थे या किसी भी तरीके से इसको क्रश करने की कोशिश करते थे. और जो कोट अनकोट नॉन वायलेंट मूवमेंट था, वो उनके लार्जर नैरेटिव में बैठता था कि ये जो है ये कंसल्टेशन डायलॉग रहेगा और ये हम इसको एज ए सेफ्टी वॉल यूज करेंगे. द रियल थ्रेट फॉर द ब्रिटिश एम्पायर वाज द रेवोल्यूशनरीज, टू बी वेरी स्ट्रेट इन.
To a very large extent, that is true, and you see that repeatedly showing through in the actions. Let's be very clear. It is the revolutionaries who were sent off to Kalapani or Mandalay and so on. They were not being sent off to, luxury jails in India. So Having said that, do remember that they were infiltrating not just these religious networks and so on, they were also infiltrating even the communist networks. In fact, to some extent, the communist movement in India was used by the British to spread a sort of idea that was anti-nationalist, so to speak, to create a schism in the revolutionary movement. So, one of the things people don't realize is that communist literature in India popped up in British-controlled jails under the support of the British themselves. And that suddenly in the 1930s, there were many of the younger revolutionaries became communists with support from, and I give evidence in the book of first-hand testimonies of people who became communist about how they used to receive Marxist literature in jail. Now, having done that, the British then infiltrated the communist movement because, of course, the communist movement had all kinds of strands.
No, this is a very important point you're saying. You are saying that the communist worked in alliance or in alliance with the British Empire in order to present that narrative which the British wanted to?
So what happened is the following, that obviously just like the Marxist literature was spreading in the world because in 1917 you had the Russian Revolution. Before that nobody knew much about Marxism, but after that a lot of interest is there, but it is kind of only one or two people here or there may have some idea of Marxism. It's really in the 30s it begins spreading, and we have lots of evidence to show that it was the British who were spreading it in the jails to revolutionaries. And interestingly, they were also infiltrating the communist movement at the same time. So what they were doing is they were creating a communist party, infiltrating it, and bringing people on board to it using this literature. And it's quite interesting. You look at who are the people who were controlling the Communist Party. They were all British communists. So the Communist Party of India was totally controlled by the British communists and to a lesser extent somewhat infiltrated by Russian communists. So the foreigners ran the Communist Party. There were a whole bunch of very well-known, later on well-known writers of the left who became famous in the post-independence period, who are mentioned in the book, who were actually collaborators. Please read the book to find out who is it that provided the information that led to the killing of Chandrasekhar Azad. It's a very famous Hindi writer, one of the most famous Hindi writers. Many of you may have read his books. He was actually a collaborator, and we do have lots of evidence to show that.
So, Mr. Sanyal, एक अंग्रेज ने कांग्रेस को स्थापित किया और अंग्रेजों ने कम्युनिस्टों के साथ मिलकर इतिहास को आगे ले जाने की कोशिश करी। हमारे देश का काफी बड़ा दुर्भाग्य रहा है, पर्टिकुलरली इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद में। मिस्टर सान्याल, ये भी हमको पढ़ाया जाता था कि जो आज़ादी हमको मिली थी 1947 में, वो सिर्फ और सिर्फ क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट के कारण मिली थी। ये अगर मैं आपको बताऊं कि जब हमको टेक्स्ट बुक्स पढ़ाई जाती थी तो 3 पार्ट्स में आती थी हिस्ट्री की टेक्स्ट बुक, और अगर आप 7th में रहेंगे तो आपको एक पार्ट पढ़ाई जाएगी, 8वीं कक्षा में रहेंगे दूसरी पार्ट, और 9th में रहेंगे तीसरी पार्ट। तो जब मैं 9th क्लास में था तब हमें 2 या 3 चैप्टर्स इस बात पे थे कि कैसे क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट ने इस देश को आजाद कराया। और जब मैं आईएनए रिवोल्ट के बारे में उसी टेक्स्ट बुक में देखता हूं तो सिर्फ 3 पैराग्राफ रहते थे, एक जैसे साइड में मेंशन रहता था। अब जो सच्चाई मैं आपकी किताब के अंदर पढ़ता हूं वो ये है कि अगर आईएनए रिवोल्ट नहीं होता या नेताजी नहीं होते तो सिर्फ क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट से आजादी नहीं मिलती।
देखिए, क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट 1942 का मूवमेंट है। वो 1943 में उसमें जो मोमेंटम था वो पूरी तरह से टूट चुकी थी। यही वक्त है जब बंगाल में बहुत सा अकाल पड़ा, उसमें 30 लाख लोग मारे गए भूख से, और यही वक्त है जब आपको मणिपुर और नागालैंड की तरफ से इंडियन नेशनल आर्मी के फौजी इंडिया में आने की कोशिश कर रहे थे। सुभाष बोस स्वयं फ्रंट लाइन पे थे। तो ये जो इतिहास है इसको आपको पढ़ाया ही नहीं जाएगा, और नहीं आपको पढ़ाया जाएगा कि 1946 में एक नेवल रिवोल्ट हुआ मुंबई में। दिस इज नॉट अ माइनर रिवोल्ट। You have to understand in 1946 what the wider context was. The Second World War had finished. Many of the European American, Australian, all these soldiers were demobilized because they all wanted to go home, because they had fought in the war for several years, they all wanted to go home. So, whether it's Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, southern Vietnam, all of these, I mean, large swath of territory, who was controlling it? It was the British Indian Army. All these Japanese soldiers who had surrendered, who do you think was guarding them? British Indian Army. So, if the British Indian Army had risen in revolt, there was a real problem. And this was about to happen in many, there were many instances of individual soldiers switching sides. For example, you have in Indonesia, Indonesia was originally a Dutch colony. When the Japanese turned up, the Dutch ran away. Now, once the Japanese had been defeated, the Dutch wanted to come back and recolonize Indonesia. But of course, the Indonesians themselves now declared independence. They had all these guns that were lying around from the Japanese, so they picked them up and they began to resist. So who do you think was sent in to suppress the Indonesians? It was the British Indian Army. Now, you can imagine the British Indian soldier is thinking, I am being used to put down the freedom struggle of the Indonesians. I have nothing to do with the Indonesians. And there were many pitched battles in which thousands of Indonesian freedom fighters died, but hundreds of Indian soldiers also died. So there were all kinds of rumors that the Indian army was about to revolt. And this is the context in which the 1946 naval revolt happens. In Mumbai, 20,000 veterans of the Second World War rise in revolt. They capture something, almost 80 ships. So it's not a small, and these are veterans, so this is not like the first time they have seen a gun. They have fought, these are the guys who fought the Japanese. They capture the city, then the Maratha regiment is sent in to suppress them. The Maratha regiment takes a periphery around the harbour and they begin shooting. But then the British commanders suddenly realize that the Marathas are shooting deliberately to miss. So they have to be removed. And they actually send in European soldiers there, and then things evolve. So this is not a trivial thing. And this thing, by the way, it spreads to Karachi, it spreads to Kolkata, and so on. And so there is already, lots of rumors of a widespread revolt. The Royal Indian Air Force is asked to bomb them. Suddenly they all, they are supposed to come in from Delhi. They land in Jodhpur and they say that they all have engine trouble. So it's quite clear that no, this is not the Indian army of the past, that the revolt in the Indian armed forces is imminent. So it is during the naval revolt that the Cabinet Committee on Indian Independence is formed by Attlee. So it doesn't happen out of context.
So 1946 was the inflection point.
Absolutely, 1946. Not 1942. What happened in 1942? Nothing happened. War continued. In fact, after this we had they continued to suck out the food out of Bengal and had the Bengal famine in which 3 million people died. So they were fully in control of the country in 1943, 44, 45. It's only in 46 that this event happens, and it's not what I'm trying to tell you is, it's not an India event. If the Indian army had risen in revolt at that point, which was clearly evident, is about imminent, then we would have ended up with the Indian army controlling everything from Egypt to southern Vietnam.
This is huge. Mr. Sanyal, if I look from 1857 to 1947, what will you consider as the inflection point in India's march to freedom? Is it, if I say, if you want to enlist the main inflection points, you enlisted 1946. But if I look at from 1857, कि अगर किसी को जानना है कि कौन से वो inflection points थे हमारे देश के struggle में towards independence, आप क्या enlist करेंगे?
Well, I don't want to summarize a long book, but let me say that, of course, the last decade of the 19th century was important, because around about 1890, the last sort of sparks of traditional elite of India's resistance to the British dies out. So you have in Manipur the nobility put up the last resistance to the British. You have Birsa Munda and the tribals, and so on. So the last attempt by traditional India to resist the British dies out and it fails. Now remember the mental situation at that time So that is the context in which you have, for example, Tilak and his Ganpati festivals. That is the context in which the Sapekar brothers carry out an assassination in Pune. That is the context in which Sri Aurobindo refuses to join the civil service, comes back to India. He begins to work with Sayaji Gaikwad of Baroda, who, by the way, is an extremely important character in our history, people. And
You have you've enlisted his role entirely, and I haven't seen this in any other book.
yeah, Sayaji Gaikwad is an extremely important character. Shyamji Krishna Varma, very successful businessman, barrister, and so on. S.R. Rana. These are people who then begin to fund a new round of resistance to the British. And then you see that in the first decade, the first generation of revolutionaries turn up in India House under Savarkar, under the Anushilan Samiti in Kolkata, under Barin Ghosh, and so on. And so that's the first generation. That first generation gets wiped out by the British. They get hanged, sent to Kalapani, and so on. Then a next generation arises. This is led by Raj Bihari Bose and Sachindranath Sanyal. And this group tries to create what is called the Gadar Revolt. You see that, for example, popping up not just in India, but particularly in North America with the Sikhs and so on. You have others like Ajit Singh, who comes out of jail, travels around the world, stoking up the nationalism. And that second generation, it puts up a great fight during the First World War, but it fails as well. In many cases, just hours before it was, these great revolts were about to happen, they kind of fall apart. Anyway, that fails. It's not completely without impact because, as you will know, it does radicalize the Indian soldier. And as these Indian soldiers come back after the war in 1919, the British are very scared that they are going to revolt. That is the context in which the Rowlatt Acts are put in place. And then, of course, it ultimately culminates in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now, if you don't know the Gadarite revolutionaries, you have no idea why on earth the Rowlatt Acts were there and Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. So, our history books don't tell you the link. Now, Jallianwala Bagh massacre happens. As an attempt to sort of cause some reconciliation, some of these revolutionary leaders are released. One of them is Sachindranath Sanyal. So he's from the second generation, but in the third generation, he becomes the main driver. And he begins to set up this umbrella network called the Hindustan Republican Association. He sets up links with the Bengal revolutionaries, but also across what is now UP. And then in Punjab, he is the one who recruits Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan, Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh, and all. These are all his recruits. And then this group begins to do various things. And then the Kakori case happens in 1925-26. And of course, this group also disintegrates. There are again hangings happen. People are sent to jail and so on. Sachin Sanyal himself is sent back to jail for 10 years to Kalapani. Then another generation arises. This is led by the next generation that he had recruited. This is Sukhdev Thapar, Rajguru, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and so on. And they keep things going till essentially the early 30s. So you have, of course, the Saunders killing, the Chittagong Armory raid, and so on. And that generation then kind of falls apart by about the early 30s because they have also, again, the British have killed them and whatever, jailed them and so on. Now what happens is that Sachin Sanyal again comes back from jail, 1937. He ties up this time with, guess who? Netaji, Subhash Chandra Bose, who has just been evicted from the Congress. And they connect then with Raj Bihari Bose. Again, these are people from the second generation who are still around. So the reason I'm telling you these linkages is then you will understand there's not random somebody got up in the morning and threw a bomb. These are the same characters. And so Raj Bihari Bose, who was living in Japan, who had escaped to Japan after the Gadar revolt had failed, he is the person who sets up the Azad Hind Forge in Singapore with Japanese help. But he's very old at this point. So he then requests for Netaji to come from Germany and take leadership of it. So these are people who knew each other, they were working together, they had enormous respect for each other, and they kept up this resistance for half a century. So to say that these people did not know and there was random acts is wrong. Now, INA also fails. But then their officers and soldiers are brought to Red Fort. They are put on trial. This is a huge sensation because remember, most of the Indian population didn't know about the INA during the war because of censorship. But now they know what had happened. They suddenly realized that Netaji had actually entered India. Now think of the electrifying impact this has on the population. And by the way, at that point in time, it's not even clear that he's dead, right? So there are all these rumors floating around about that he may suddenly return. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Indian army is spread across from Egypt to Vietnam. And so you have all these murmurings of revolt. And that is the context in which this 1946 revolt is in the Navy happens. In fact, they are explicitly state that they are inspired by the revolutionaries because they call themselves, by the way, they rename themselves the Indian National Navy.
Mr. Sanyal, this is astonishing, and I'm again saying कि ये काफी generations को इसके बारे में पता ही नहीं. तो there was an ideology, there was a method, there were interlinkages, there was a plan, and it survived half a century. Yes. And there were interlinkages. And ultimately succeeded because 1946 के just एक साल बाद हमको आजादी मिली.
Yes, in fact that the announcement of the Cabinet Commission for Indian Independence happens in the middle of the naval revolt. It doesn't happen before the naval revolt. Is it a coincidence? Of course not.
मिस्टर सान्याल, मैं लास्ट दो आपसे सवाल पूछना चाहता हूँ. एक और विचित्र बात ये है मिस्टर सान्याल कि जितने भी रेवोल्यूशनरीज थे उनको कर्ब करने के लिए ब्रिटिश एम्पायर उनको काला पानी भेजती थी, पर कोट अनकोट मॉडरेट्स को इस तरीके की कठोर सजा कभी भी जो है ना काला पानी के जेलों में भेजी गई, ना फांसी पर टांगा गया, ना लंबे अंतराल तक वो जेल में रहे. तो क्या एक अंडरस्टैंडिंग थी दोनों के बीच में कि जब कोई चीज थोड़ी सी, जैसे कहते हैं ना कि अगर पानी ज्यादा उबल रहा है तो उसको थोड़ा कम करने के लिए आप उनको जेल में भेज दीजिए, पर रियल जो प्रॉब्लम थी ब्रिटिश एम्पायर के लिए वरी थी फ्रॉम 1857 वर दीज रेवोल्यूशनरी थॉट्स, जो उनको पता था कि अगर वो पूरे देश में स्प्रेड हो जाएंगे तो अल्टीमेटली उनको हिंदुस्तान को छोड़ना होगा.
So you tell me, you take the judgment. I've written the book, but let me say that Savarkar, who is claimed to have become a great lover of the British, he was put in Kala Pani, not any other jail, for 14 odd years. Before that also he had been in jail in London and in Mumbai during his trial. Then after he was released, he was put under house arrest in Ratnagiri for another decade plus. Obviously, there was no love lost there. Similarly, Sachindranath Sanyal, you think about it, he was sent to jail in 1915. He comes out in 1920 after the Jallianwala Bagh issue, and there's an amnesty. He's out of jail only for 5 odd years. Then Kakodi case happens, he's back in jail. He's sent off to Kala Pani for a decade after that. So he's in jail for a full decade. Then he comes out in 1937. Then he gets back to doing the same thing. Then for 3-4 years he's free, and 1941 he's put back in jail again. 40 or 41, he's back in jail again. So the man, more than half of his life he was in jail, and not in any, Aga Khan Palace or Naini Jail's luxury wing. He is put in a serious jail and subjected to continuous torture, deliberately done to break him. And every time he comes up and does the same thing. And you see that over and over again with others as well.
मेरा लास्ट सवाल आपसे मिस्टर सान्याल, मैं चाहता हूँ सवाल ही नहीं, मैं चाहता हूँ कि ये कमिटमेंट आपसे चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि जो आपने इस किताब के जरिए करने की कोशिश करी है ये आने वाली जनरेशन्स याद रखेगी, क्योंकि मैं कहता हूँ ये इन्फ्लेक्शन पॉइंट है. पर मैं आपसे कमिटमेंट चाहता हूँ कि जो आपने किताब रेवोल्यूशनरीज द अदर स्टोरी ऑफ हाउ इंडिया वन इट्स फ्रीडम इंग्लिश में लिखी है, फॉर इट टू रीच टू लार्ज ऑडियंस एंड फॉर कि एक गांव के अंदर व्यक्ति को भी पता चले कि क्या सच्चाई, मैं चाहता हूं कि ये आपसे कमिटमेंट चाहता हूं कि जितनी ज्यादा लैंग्वेजेस के अंदर इसके ट्रांसलेशंस आ सके या किताब आ सके, ये देश के लिए बहुत भला.
तो अनुवाद किया जा रहा है, हिंदी में जो अनुवाद है वो उसका काम शुरू हो चुका है. अब इसमें बांग्ला विभिन्न भाषाओं में करेंगे. जिन भाषाओं को मैं स्वयं पढ़ सकता हूँ उनमें मैं योगदान दूंगा, लेकिन दूसरे भाषाएं हैं तो दूसरे जो भी ट्रांसलेटर हैं आपके माध्यम से उनसे मैं अनुरोध करूंगा कि आप आइए, और इस किताब को देखिए, अगर आपके लायक लगता है तो आप इसका अनुवाद करिए, हम आपको इसका, आई एम श्योर हार्पर कॉलिंस विल बी हैप्पी टू सेल यू द राइट्स।
लेडीज एंड जेंटलमैन, वो देश जो अपने सही इतिहास को नहीं जानता वो कभी भी विश्व गुरु या बड़ा नहीं बन सकता है। और अब समय आ गया है कि आजादी के अमृत काल के अंदर जब हम सच्चाई को आगे ले जा रहे हैं और हिंदुस्तान को एक वैश्विक शक्ति बनाने की बात कर रहे हैं, तब जरूरी है कि हमारे देश की 80% आबादी जो 40 साल से कम की है और जो डेमोग्राफिक डिविडेंड की हम बात करते हैं, उसको सही इतिहास पढ़ाया जाए, जिससे वो आगे चल के देश में अलग अलग स्थानों में लीडर्स बन सके। और उसके अंतर्गत में मैं कोई मार्केटिंग नहीं कर रहा, मैं सत्य की बात कर रहा हूँ। रेवोल्यूशनरीज द अदर स्टोरी ऑफ हाउ इंडिया वन इट्स फ्रीडम बाय संजीव सान्याल will be a very, very big contribution. Thank you so much, Mr. Sanyal, for joining me on ITV Network India News. Thank you. Namaskar.
इंडिया न्यूज लड़ेगा जनता का मुकदमा।